recorded. So welcome to everybody. We're so pleased to see so many people here. I know it's not a great time for everybody. Trying to find a time that suits people all over the place is very difficult. So thank you all so much for coming. And as I said before, it's great to see so many familiar names on the list. Fantastic to see you all. So welcome everybody to the first in our new series of Anatolian lectures from Arwa. Obviously set up with the idea of promoting the archaeology of Western and Central Asia. And we have organized this together with Rana Özbal and Michele Massa, all of us here in Turkey, with an idea of bringing you a program of really varied presentations on the subject of identities, which is an enormously important part of archaeology, obviously, for all of us. And we wanted to bring as many different perspectives on this as possible. So we have 9 lectures in this series in February and March, from all periods, all covering topics all the way from the Paleolithic until the medieval times. So hopefully something for everybody to enjoy. Yes. So without further ado, and on the theme of identities and how we can think about identities in archaeology, we are very pleased to have our first presenter, Sera Yelözer, who is currently working on the Small Things, Big Stories project. She is a specialist in personal ornaments, as I'm sure you all know. She completed her PhD at Istanbul University on the ornaments of Aşikli Höyük. She's been working on ornaments from all kinds of different places in Turkey, from late prehistory. She's also been working in the University of Bordeaux on ornaments, more data to do with ornaments. Fantastic data gathering. And obviously, I'm also speaking as an ornament specialist. It's great to see people working in detail on prehistoric ornaments. It's something that has not been very much researched in Turkey until quite recently. So it's a fantastically exciting area to be working in, because everything that gets done is brand new. So for this reason, along with many others, Sera's research is really exciting, and she's going to give you a big overview of all kinds of ways that we can think about identities using ornaments in the later prehistory of Turkey. So I will hand over to Sera, who should be able to share her slides, I hope.
I'm trying now. Okay. Okay, I think it's working fine. Okay.
There we go. Perfect. Brilliant. Okay, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Emma. And thank you all for inviting me to give the first lecture in the series. I'm very happy to be a part of the lecture series. So today I will try to explore ways of understanding cultural and individual identities in Anatolia throughout prehistory by focusing on some snapshots from different periods through a study of personal ornaments, as Emma explained better than me actually in the intro. First, I will try to give a brief definition, not a definition per se, but I will try to talk about a bit on what constitutes our identities, like different concepts. And then I will talk a little bit about the traditional narratives towards identity and body adornment in Anatolian prehistory. And in an attempt to question how we can challenge those traditional narratives, I will try to give some brief insights from archaeology, ethnography, and evolutionary anthropology. And this will be followed by case studies from Anatolian prehistory from the late Paleolithic to the early Bronze Age. So this is a big question and very difficult to explain, to be honest. But we can define it as a complex web of relations that define us and how we situate ourselves within social contexts. And there are components of it, such as our bodies, how our bodies change bioculturally, as in life cycles, and how our bodily appearances also change along with that. So it is fluid throughout our life courses, and it can also be embraced and then abandoned and then re-embraced in certain moments in our lives or other different social contexts. It is also formed and negotiated through our social roles, tasks, daily routines, and habits. And last but not least, identities are formed by social relations in different scales, such as between individuals, between communities, and generations also. So considering all of these in mind, I find the best definition comes from Oliver Harris as the outcome of relations that constitute bodies, things, and people, which also makes us think that material culture, such as personal ornaments, has a very central role in this. But despite its complex definition, the traditional mainstream approaches towards identity in Anatolian prehistory especially has been a little bit simplistic. The traditional approaches have tended to associate burial customs, architecture, imagery, and body adornment with most often with concepts of status, social inequality, status, prestige, male dominance, and then opposing to that with goddesses and fertility. And these approaches kind of still persist. For example, in a recent publication, personal ornaments from Neolithic burials have been associated with concepts such as elegance and as an indicator of a stratified social structure. But I want to ask, can we get a more nuanced understanding of identity and difference if we abandon the stratified social structure discourse? For example, in ethnographic contexts, studies show that egalitarianism does not always mean sameness. So we can imagine, in other words, that social differentiation and different ways of displaying cultural and individual identities do not necessarily have to take place in a stratified social setting. And personal ornaments give insights into meaningful and complex ways to think about identity and difference. To start, I want to talk a little bit about the different meanings and functions of ornaments and how they have been approached in archaeological and ethnographic contexts. For example, researchers have shown that personal adornment was amongst the earliest means of the culturalization of the body and sharing sociocultural information via painting, piercing, and decorating the body. A very recently published article, for example, has identified distinct cultural groups, cultural identities that were signaled via different practices of body adornment, but it was not necessarily defined by kinship or genetic ties. Ethnographic examples, for example, show exchange, reciprocity, and gift giving, help sharing of cultural traits. They create and enhance social status and social relations, such as for example, the female solidarity groups in some hunter-gatherer populations where gift giving, for example, gift giving of necklaces and bracelets contribute to the sustaining of those different social groups. But also in archaeology, we see sometimes cultural identities persist despite this kind of contacts between different cultures. And another I think, very meaningful way of thinking about ornaments is the concept of objects of attachment. In her recent book, Penny Spickins, for example, says, I'm quoting her, objects that act like compensatory attachment figures also tend to be easily portable and show many signs of wear. And I think this definition fits perfectly well with the personal ornaments we find in archaeological contexts. And to these approaches, I also want to add the metaphorical, performative, and fluid meanings of body decoration to add an emphasis on the importance of context in our studies. For example, in this quote here, we see that tying strings, for example, bracelets on the wrists of babies, is also a metaphorical performance. And in the same vein, for example, for pregnant women, tying strings around their belly while they were pregnant has a special meaning. And then after the baby is born and weaned, women change the location on the body where they tie the strings of adornment. This example shows, for example, the context-specific functions and meanings of body adornment practices, as well as their changes in use throughout the life cycle of both adults and also infants and children. And also we see that meanings can be related not only to the object, but also to the acts and performances inherent to their use. So from there, I want to give a little bit of simplistic overview as a background to our topic. Here you see the temporal trends in personal ornamentation practices in Anatolia. So for the Upper Paleolithic, we have unfortunately few evidence, but this is mostly due to lack of research, we can say. But thanks to extensive research in one side, dating to the initial Upper Paleolithic, that is the Üç Ağızlı Cave, we know that certain shells, such as the Tritya gibbosula you see here, have been very persistently used throughout periods since the Upper Paleolithic onwards. And then with the Epipaleolithic, similar to what was going on in the neighboring regions, we start to see stone beads in addition to shells. But then with especially the PPMB, we begin to see complex technological practices that require the application of several technical steps and the know-how to implement them, which came along with the diversification of bead forms. And this investment in stone bead production and experimentation of techniques and forms continues into the later Neolithic. During this period, we see the use of already known techniques on materials that were previously not used in a big extent. So after this overview, the first snapshot the case study I want to look at is the Pınarbaşı rock shelter in central Anatolia. So as early as the late Epipaleolithic, we see somehow an interplay between mobility and identity expression in mortuary contexts. Recent research at the site have started to give evidence in favor of its use as an extensive cemetery. It is located about 180 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast. And recent isotopic studies have shown the mobility of local individuals. And there we have adults as well as sub-adults buried with Mediterranean shells. So possibly hinting at the mobility of adults and then the sharing and the transmission of beads among different generations, which end up in funerary contexts. And then moving to Southeast Anatolia, and with the formation of the earliest sedentary settlements, we see, especially in this region, we see an enormous diversification of forms, materials, and technologies. So this site, Boncuklu Tarla, it's a pre-pottery Neolithic site from the PPNA until the end of PPMB, located in Mardin, is currently a part of a project led by Emma Baysal, to understand the human ornament relationships and its role in identity construction. And I will just briefly touch upon some preliminary evidence we have on the role of ornaments in identity construction at Boncuklu Tarla in different scales, because we have in situ evidence from the burials suggesting the presence of two different scales of body adornment practices, one being altering bodily appearances in a permanent way, like the use of ear plugs and labrets, lip plugs. And ethnographically, we know these practices most often are associated with rites of passages. And the other practice is the temporary ornamentation practices, of course, in the form of beads and pendants, and they're used in life as well as in burial rituals. So there was a high investment in the enhancement and diversification of bodily appearances, and it was coupled with some of the earliest technological advances we see. For example, the use of obsidian in ornament production, which is a very hard and hard to work material. Here you see an example of an obsidian earplug, if you will. We see abrasion striations and chipping scars. So as early as PPN, and before that, we know that obsidian is more extensively used in ornament production during the Halaf period. But with these examples, we start to understand the roots of these complex technologies. And the assemblage also allows us to track the rescaling of a regional symbolism onto the human body, because we know these symbols and concepts that we know in larger, more monumental scales from other sites in the region. For example, at Göbekli Tepe, Gusir Höyük, Körtik Tepe, and other sites. At Boncuklu Tarla were somehow rescaled onto the human body to be carried on the body, like the bracers and the belts and the zoomorphic and anthropomorphic pendants, for example. The widespread distribution of these symbolic practices in the region has suggested their role in a shared regional or a cultural identity. But in this example, we have the chance to investigate how these symbols and practices might have been related to maybe individual lives and identities of, for example, gender, age, personhood, etc. So it gives a very exciting ground to beginning investigating these concepts. And our studies have recently started, but we already have evidence also suggesting that some of the beads found in burials as parts of larger composite ornaments were used before being buried with those individuals. And beads found in burials provide us with actually snapshots in prehistory to understand their role in identity construction and the diverse practices relating to biological sex and age categories, through which we can discuss concepts such as gender, social age, personhood, and so on. And my studies in 2 PPN sites in Central Anatolia have been focusing on that issue, actually. And most of the data comes from Aşikli, which is a very well-known transitional site in Cappadocia, from the initial stages of sedentism to the formation of a large and dense village settlement. And at Aşikli, we have a total of 103 individuals buried on site, but the burials with beads, they belong to the later phases, dating to the 8th millennium BC, and they constitute around 29%, 30 individuals of the overall number, and among them, female adults, followed by sub-adults, and then adult males. Males are majority. And the earliest individuals buried with ornaments were infants and children, the earliest one dating to the early 8th millennium BC. And this child was buried in a building that is larger in size in comparison to the contemporary buildings. And we have some evidence in favor of its communal use. And the child was buried with 3 stone beads on the neck, all displaying traces of use wear, so suggesting that the beads were in circulation for a long time, possibly, presumably before the burial of the child. And a couple of phases later, we see the adorned adult individuals during the mid-8th millennium BC. The first 2 adult burials who were buried with ornaments belong to male adults buried in the same building during different phases. And here we see a combination of different concepts in ornament use. For example, one individual among the bead group the individual was buried with, one example has used were in the form of a notch formation on its perforation edge and some irregular striations on the same face, suggesting the use of the item maybe like as a button before being assembled into a composite ornament to be buried with the individual. And the other individual stands out in terms of raw material diversity, the number of beads in a single ornament, the use of non-local items, and the mixing of new and old technologies, such as the combination of shells with the butterfly beads that you see here, made from very hard knappable stone types. And the number of Mediterranean shells used in this ornament is actually more than half of the overall number of shells we found at the site throughout phases and contexts. And furthermore, the two large butterfly beads, although belonging to the same technological procedure, they display nuances in technology. For example, the carnelian bead has a dull polish, whereas the other butterfly bead has a higher polished, like lustered surface, suggesting different finishing techniques had been applied. And such technologically complex beads were actually not exclusive to adults. Sorry. And one example comes from a rare instance of a double burial, a child buried with an adult. And the beads, you can see here, all were found on the child's neck. They're similar in composition, technology, material, and form to the adult ornaments we see at Aşikli. For example, you can see here that the carnelian butterfly bead has a very perfectly well-aligned perforation, indicating a skilled producer that managed to drill two long perforation tubes with perfect alignment. And on the other beads, we see use wear in the form of polish, irregular striations, and also perforation edge deformation. All of this, again, suggesting that the infants and children at the site were buried with items that had been possibly in circulation for a very long time before their death. And also through sub-adult adornment, we can discuss some other concepts such as social age and personhood. At Aşikli, being buried with assembled ornaments that are similar in quantity to adult ornaments is exclusive to children above the age of 3. The infants and children below that age only had single beads or bead pairs. And we know from some ethnographic examples that identity and personhood attribution comes from after a certain age that is marked by some biocultural thresholds such as weaning and walking. And in some cases, this was also signified through different personal ornamentation practices. So presumably at Aşikli, such a practice of, such an age-specific practice of ornamentation could be interpreted as the age of 3 being significant to attribute children personhood, and it might have been signified through the use of adornment similar to adults. And we are starting to gain further evidence to suggest that sub-adult adornment was a means to create social ties and attribute identity as a wider Neolithic phenomenon. And one such example comes from Boncuklu. It's a neighboring site in Cappadocia, and we have earlier adorned burials at this site, dating to the mid to late 9th millennium BC. And in one of the buildings we excavated in 2022, a child, you can see here, was buried in the earliest phase, and then during the later phase, an infant was buried. All had heavily used, broken and then reused personal ornaments. So the transmission of items was a way of creating social ties, in a way, maybe between individuals of different generations, which we can track in the funerary record through personal ornaments. So now returning to Aşikli, Another way to track those social relations is an investigation of the bead type associations between individuals. For example, the use of single beads, most often in green color, at Aşikli was exclusive to females above the age of 40 and, as I said, sub-adults below the age of 3. And to that, we have rare examples, but the red pigment use we can add because we don't see it with male burials. And also as part of an ongoing research with colleagues from Bordeaux University, we are starting to apply statistical and network analysis on this data set. I'm not going to show it here today, but I'm going to show another preliminary analysis, discriminant analysis, when we plot individuals based on their biological sex and age categories and bead type associations. We see that middle and old adult females and sub-adults cluster somewhat tightly, but more importantly, the middle adult males cluster very tightly. One old adult male is kind of in between. So we're trying to understand and begin investigating how those bead type associations contributed to the formation of social groups within the community. But we can say that there was an emphasis on age across all of these variations and similarities in ornamentation practices at Aşikli that suggest the importance of age and life course in the construction of identities. So, for example, we have no newborns with beads. Being buried with beads begins only after 1 month, and until 3 years of age, we have either sub-adults with single beads, in some cases with bead pairs. And more importantly, we know through isotopic studies that weaning ends at Aşikli at 2 years of age. So the sub-adults around 3 years of age who had ornaments similar to adult ornaments were no longer breastfeeding. So it might have been a factor in attributing identity, even personhood maybe. But more interestingly, after that, until 30 years of age, no children, no young adults, adolescents, they didn't have beads. So another dimension could relate to reaching a certain age, like the age of 30. And after that, some individuals had bead groups that had various materials and technologies known from distant regions. So another dimension we can add to the formation of identities could be participating in certain interaction networks. So this takes us to the technological aspects of beads, like the butterfly beads in Central Anatolia, and the interplay between technology, meaning, and value. These beads, as I had mentioned, belong to complex technological processes, and they have striking morphometric, typological, and technological similarities with the Middle Euphrates sites, such as Abu Hureyra, Tel Halula, etc. But in Central Anatolia, at Aşikli and Balıklı, we have no evidence for their on-site production, which suggests their arrival in the region as exchange commodities with a sort of socio-economic value. And at Aşikli, both females and males had access to these import materials. So in adult burials, they perhaps signified the social roles and their participation in exchange networks. But at the same time, we see these beads in sub-adult burials too. So they also gain another dimension of meaning, maybe attributing those beads intimate functions that signify social ties between adults and some young children. And also these beads are also a means to approach the actions, skill levels, and decision-making processes of individual artisans, and by extension to understand different social categories in prehistory, such as craftspeople. So, for example, a study of the drilling profiles of these carnelian beads, we have detected that they have different alignment and different morphologies. For example, the well-aligned examples show the control of the driller over the material, the tool, as well as their motions. But we also have slanted but aligned examples, which shows their adaptability and solutions when encountered with difficulties during the drilling processes. At the same time, variation in tube morphologies indicate the use of different tools. So we can say that these beads were produced possibly at different times or by different bead makers, and then brought together, accumulated in the same ornament through time after exchange and circulation. We can think about similar concepts through disc beads assembled into composite ornaments also. For example, in the case of a 3-year-old child buried with a bead group that had disc beads from different colors and measurements, we see that their measurements show some of them overlap, but they were probably based on raw material produced in different groups and then assembled within the same ornament. So we can think that combination of such technological variations in the same ornament suggests that beads were often produced in different times by different bead makers and then brought together in the same ornament. So this was the story, not all of it, but some parts of it for the PPN. But what happens after the PPN, pre-pottery Neolithic in Anatolia? So we see during the late Neolithic that there is something new going on with especially shell beads. For example, we see new geometric forms, new shell types, suggesting the multidirectional movement of concepts and ideas, especially from the west to the east towards Western Anatolia, even to Central Anatolia at Çatal Höyük, where we see like a melting pot of Western and Eastern ornamental preferences. But the high investment in stone bead production continues and proliferates. We see skilled production with roots in the earlier PPMB, but at the same time, we begin to see dedicated workshops, for example, at Kumartepe and production areas in Aşikli Höyük in Central Anatolia, also in Domuztepe and Terkurdu, also the use of obsidian. And along with that, we see new technologies and cross-craft interactions such as heating, metallurgy, coloring technologies. All of this suggest the sharing of new cultural elements between communities and regions. So identities begin interacting in new ways, but also artisanal identities, craftspeople begin to become a much more tangible concept. So I'm going to return to Balıklı now because the post-Neolithic, we have some post-Neolithic intrusive burials at the site, dating roughly to the 5th millennium BC. And these burials and their ornaments offer a glimpse into these new concepts, such as new technologies, as well as mobility and landscape interaction. So during the 5th millennium BC, the site was visited by presumably a mobile group, because apart from burials, we have no evidence of their activities at the site. And they buried some of their dead inside graves that were dug into the walls of an earlier Neolithic building that you see here. And one of the individuals was buried with small disc beads, you can see here, and discoid freshwater unio beads. And all of them were covered with a paste-like red residue that stick them together. Also, we see this residue kind of twisted, resembling maybe a string. But I want to especially focus on the unio beads here, because this type of configuration of shell beads is rather unique in Anatolia, as far as I know. We know unio beads with slightly similar forms from late Çatal Höyük during the during the pottery Neolithic. But I think more similar examples dating to the same period, to the 5th millennium BC, comes from a site near the Caspian Sea, actually. In this case, marine shells were used in a very similar composition. So this kind of a relationship may suggest a far-reaching connection and mobility between distant regions, but at the same time, in this case, the use of locally available freshwater shells as a substitute, in a sense, may relate to the adaptation of cultural identities and memory in a different setting in Cappadocia. And another contemporaneous burial was a young adult male with pathologies related to a dislocated shoulder that might have resulted with impaired mobility. And again, we see the use of a paste-like red residue covering the surface of beads, sticking them together, but also this morphology suggests its use in maybe coloring the strings as well. So ochre, red pigments, or presumably ochre, has always been associated with symbolic meanings, but in these examples we see an interplay between symbolic and functional uses of pigments in a sense. So the next millennia, early Bronze Age, witnessed dramatic changes in social organization of communities. So here I will give an example from Aşikli Höyük EBA burials. Thanks to the amazing work done by Emma Baysal and Gonca Dardeniz, we have good evidence, and we can tell multiple tales from graves, such as the beads show mass production as well as various procurement strategies. We have sources and technologies indicating long-distance trade, such as shells from Red Sea, metal pins from Iran, as well as carnelian beads that suggest connections with the East, for example, the Indus civilizations, but also with the West, for example, with Troy, and all combined in the same ornament and placed in the graves with individuals. But we also see worn and fresh examples within the same composite items of adornment, like you see here. And some beads display very pronounced wear, indicating their prolonged use lives and curations. And these ornaments belonging to young individuals bring together different objects and at the same time stories. We see items brought to the site via long distance trade, items belonging to complex crafting processes, both heavily used and unused items, suggesting that these objects were possibly transmitted between individuals, perhaps within the same social group, rather than signifying individual merit-based status as suggested for this period. So through some snapshots from the late Epipaleolithic to the early Bronze Age, I've tried to track cultural and personal identities via body adornment in different contexts. But along these different periods, we see some recurrent themes actually that contribute to the construction and display of identities. One of them is the interplay between innovation and conservation. We see new technologies were often combined with forms known from earlier periods that can be regarded as familiar things memorized. And in most cases, objects are very worn, indicating their transmission between individuals or generations through which memory was created, sustained, and transmitted. And through the use of beads, we see a twofold emphasis on life cycle, age, and social relations, as well as exchange and far-reaching connections. But we still have big research gaps to complete the picture, actually, for two crucial periods in Anatolia. One is the Upper Paleolithic, to understand the roots of these practices, but also we have huge evidence from Upper Paleolithic Europe in the use regarding the use of ornaments in the construction of both cultural and individual identities, but we don't know much for Upper Paleolithic in Anatolia. But we also lack crucial contextual evidence for late Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods also. So this is what I have for today, but all of this research wouldn't have been possible without the help and mentoring and collaboration of many people. Some I managed to mention here, some I couldn't. And thank you all very much for your patience.